This is a Stories to be Told podcast. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Stories to be Told, the podcast series. I'm Tracy DW, founder and creator of Stories to be Told, and if this is your first time joining us, I want to give you a huge welcome to our podcast series and our growing community. I'd also like to say a big thank you to all of you who engaged with the free promotion that I organised on Amazon at the end of May, early June. Your reviews and your feedback are so important in helping me to make this project even better for those of you who are getting so much value out of this. Also, don't forget to click the follow button and follow my author profile on Amazon. In this podcast, I decided to go off the beaten path and take a look at a former colony that was never occupied by the British, despite the ongoing conflict with France and Spain to claim territory in the Caribbean throughout the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. You may be asking, well, if it's not a former British colony, then why are you making a focus of it? The simple reason is that when you're conducting your own learning journey about a particular topic, anomalies will always crop up, and you make a decision about whether they are important enough to take notice of, or do you just walk on by and keep it rolling? In the case of Haiti, I felt I had to make an exception, and attention must be paid. This is what I think is the beauty of the learning journey, as it can be completely self-directed as opposed to always following a prescriptive lesson program, and Stories to be Told supports this self-directed approach. If you haven't visited storiestobetold.com, then please do so and check out the learning journeys, mini documentaries, poetic narratives and alternative history artwork. More content and poetic narrative releases are planned for the summer and later on this year. Much has been discussed about Haiti's situation in terms as to whether the origins of the country's problems are caused by the history of colonial and foreign political oppression or its own internal inhibiting factors. Once known as the Jewel of the Antilles, Haiti was one of the world's richest colonies in terms of crop production. It accounted for almost 50% of France's GDP. In 1492, Columbus encountered the western part of the island and established an early settlement called Navidad. The island became a Spanish colony and was renamed Hispaniola, or Little Spain. In 1697, the western portion, accounting for around 3/8 of the island, was ceded by the Spanish to France through the Treaty of Ryswick, and this portion of the island was renamed San Domingo. The French established and enforced a ruthless system of enslavement where thousands of Africans were shipped from the west coast of Africa and from America and other Caribbean islands. The trade pattern wasn't a profitable triangle, but more of a one-way street where coffee and predominantly sugar were shipped to France, refined and distributed across Europe and traded for other luxury goods and materials. Haiti's historical significance is huge. It was the first country in the world to abolish slavery, the second republic in the Americas, and the only state formed as a direct result of a successful slave revolt. Being a founding member of the United Nations and Association of Caribbean States, a member of CARICOM, the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization, it is a contradiction that Haiti remains the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. In this podcast, I'd like to focus on Haiti's predicament by asking two questions. Firstly, why did the revolution succeed in bringing about victory for the enslaved of Haiti? And secondly, why did the process of independence fail to bring freedom, equality, and economic stability, wealth, and well-being to all its people? I'd like to explore perspectives in answer to the former question through events brought about by divine intervention, and the latter question through factors instigated by human failure. The Haitian Revolution began on an August night in 1791, where it wasn't long before Africans claimed their first real victim in capturing and burning the Cap Français, the French seat of colonial power on the island. A former enslaved African, Toussaint Louverture, 1743 to 1803, a truly dynamic and forceful military leader, was instrumental in gathering the masses and morphing them into an army that was so effective that during the course of the next decade it was able to withstand the attack of any anti-revolutionist, including tens of thousands of British redcoats between 1794 to 99. By 1800, Napoleon was desperate to maintain his overseas empire and made a last-ditch attempt to not only regain San Domingo from the Africans, but also Louisiana from the Spanish. France had agreed to a short-lived truce with the Second Coalition led by Britain through the Treaty of Amiens, 1802-03. However, despite this and the capture and imprisonment of Louverture at Fort de Joux in the Jura Mountains by Charles Leclerc, Napoleon's brother-in-law, the Africans of Haiti continued to resist, emerging victorious battle after battle over the French, who eventually perished, including Leclerc, to malaria, yellow fever, and defeat. San Domingo was renamed Haiti, the original name for the island given by the indigenous Taino people, who were all but wiped out by the Spanish. The first constitution stated that only Africans could rule in Haiti and rejected the ideology of European control and African enslavement. The 22nd of December 1803 marked not only the beginning of a new republic, but also the end of the French Empire in the Americas, with the sale of Louisiana to a newly independent American 13 colonies earlier that year. 4 years later, Britain marked the abolishment of slavery in 1807 and then, across its empire, in 1833 to formally bring about the end of First World slavery and perhaps to gain some kind of moral capital in answer to the events in Haiti. So why did the revolution succeed? From my perspective, it could only have come through a divine intervention. A series of events transpired and conspired to bring about a unique set of circumstances that worked to the Africans' advantage. By 1790, San Domingo was overpopulated with Africans who outnumbered the French almost by 10 to 1. This population imbalance was a precarious model to base a system of enslavement upon. It was a miracle that this system remained productive for almost a century, transforming this stretch of land into one of the world's most valuable pieces of real estate at the time. This overpopulation meant that many Africans were able to escape the harsh and brutal life of the plantations and reside up in the mountainous regions of the country. Here, they would form a cohesive network of maroon communities, as it was easy to retain their mother languages, customs and values. In parallel to this, freed slaves and their mixed-race counterparts, referred to as mulattoes, acquired the social and material status to form a new middle class. Unknown to the French, an alternative society was beginning to emerge. A second act of divine intervention came through the French Revolution beginning in 1789, 2 years prior to the Haitian Revolution. Back in France, the growing French middle class and nobility wanted an end to the feudal system and the drawing up of a new constitution and new political culture. 1792 marked a new era with the end of the French monarchy the establishment of a republic and the redistribution of church land. All this, together with the declaration by revolutionaries in the French National Assembly to free all slaves in 1794, one can only surmise that France's preoccupation with its own internal issues, as well as anti-abolition sentiment, must have created a power vacuum in Haiti, and thus a perfect storm. So, why was the process of independence unsuccessful for the country? What were the human failures, and to whom do we attribute them to? A key factor had to be the perception of Haiti as a danger to Europe and to the West, due to being a former European colony now occupied by former enslaved Africans. Unlike the American 13 colonies, Haiti was not initially recognised as a republic, and its economy was plunged into chaos. America expanded through the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, while Haiti retracted. Haiti's republican status was not recognised by Britain until 1833, America in 1865 and France in 1825, and only after Haiti had agreed to pay reparation to France, a debt that was not repaid in full until 1947, and any remaining debt was cancelled and written off by the World Bank in May 2010, coinciding with the earthquake that hit the country in January that year. From my perspective, the refusal of Europe and the West to recognise Haiti as an independent and free state is significant. It is at the heart of the ideology that Africans are incapable of self-rule and need to be controlled, governed and patronised. African victory was completely incomprehensible in Europe, as Africans, their land and labour were perceived as resources purely for exploitation to aid the accumulation of wealth across Europe. When the earthquake hit Haiti in 2010, I remember watching the news and listening to rapper Wyclef Jean making a declaration to run as a presidential candidate for his own country. I thought that this was such a noble and patriotic thing to do, but I was surprised and appalled at the lack of support that he received. How could the international community pat itself on the back for bringing aid to Haiti, while ignoring a man who wanted to do the best for his own country? Upon learning more about the country's history, I have come to understand more about why this happened. The denial of self-empowerment and a refusal to give a country some recognition, even in the face of natural disaster, leaves a bitter taste in the mouth and is hard to swallow. Another aspect of human failure was how the process of establishing independence began. The saying, "the way things begin is often the way that they continue," has never been more true than that for Haiti. The independence that was initially achieved splintered into two movements after 1803, becoming a kingdom and a republic, and Dessalines, a right-hand man of Louverture, was assassinated in 1806. With the two chief instigators eliminated, there came a long list of short-lived periods of leadership. Dessalines was replaced by Pétion, then Boyer, who was ousted in 1843, then Hérard, replaced by Philippe Guerrier, who died in 1844, who was then replaced by Jean-Louis Perrier in 1845. These frequent changes in leadership across the Republic, with constant failed attempts to invade, conquer, and combine with what is now the Dominican Republic, must have severely hampered the much-needed stability required to achieve unity amongst the people and agreement upon a common direction. From my perspective, this was a huge mistake, as I believe seeking stability and unity within the population is vital before even considering expansion, and this split into a republic and a kingdom revealed hidden weaknesses and divisions that were prevalent too early on in the independence process and resolved possibly too late. This is reminiscent of my previous podcast episode, Zanu and Zapu, Contrasts and Similarities, where I explore perspectives on how independence is often easier to achieve than national unity. Feel free to listen to that episode after listening to this one. Finally, I think there was a power vacuum on another level. The migration of the French out of Haiti to France and America must have left a huge void in terms of not only a society, but also knowledge about government and infrastructure. This void became occupied by the freed black and mulattoes who had formed a new middle class. They in turn adopted the values, language and customs as well as the plantation systems of their former oppressors, and in doing so failed to address the problem of inequality, as they had no substitute to replace the systems that they knew and had become accustomed to. Haiti's predicament can be seen as a precursor to the experiences and events that played out in other newly independent former colonies some 200 years later. Haiti's story is one that may tell of a unique set of circumstances, but its lesson is universal. While we aim to aspire to achieve some sense of utopia through acts of altruism, we so often succumb to the things that appeal to our human nature, such as greed and the need for power. Now, my questions for further thought and reflection are: if Haiti had been recognised as a republic in 1804, what would have been the impact and ramifications for this nation? What opportunities could have been created and what difficulties could have been avoided? As other European nations and colonies struggled to reinvent themselves during this period of time, why were their internal conflicts accepted and recognised as valid steps towards a common good, while this was not the case for African states? What do you think are the reasons for this difference in perception? Is this perception still widely held today? Finally, independent colonies that mainly consist of European populations achieve better outcomes in terms of infrastructure, economic wealth and social well-being than colonies that are predominantly African or of other ethnicities. What factors have caused these discrepancies? If you liked this podcast, then stay on my website or this listening platform and check out my other podcasts related to this episode, such as Zanu and Zapu Contrasts and Similarities, which I mentioned earlier on, and also the Book of Negroes, How Africa Came to Nova Scotia, which sheds more light on the experiences of the African diaspora during the late 1700s. Finally, don't forget what I call the heart and soul of the Stories to be Told movement. My stories, or poetic narratives, Caribbean Wind, Caribbean Rush, Nights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference 1884, and Gone with the Wind, Macmillan's Speech for Change. They are all available on the website and through Amazon. Feel free once again to like, follow and share us on Facebook and Instagram. The free promo is now over, but you can visit the website to join our mailing list, where you receive a free sample of all 4 titles. As always, it is a pleasure and a privilege to share my learning journey with you in this podcast, and I encourage you to either continue or begin your own. History is a matter of fact or perspective. Thanks so much for listening once again, and I'll see you on the next page.